Let me start with an obvious point, which is to say, I think this is a fantastically important piece of work, but I also really appreciate the way that you've tried to address public policy debates with this data, and done it in a very human way, actually. I think the life stories are absolutely fantastic, because it often strikes me, we have these discussions about data as though they're not about people. We had this bizarre episode a few weeks ago where there was a discussion about the incidence of poverty on the $1.25 line, and the numbers were going up or down by 200 million or so.
Right.
And part of you thinks, we are talking about real people's lives here, and I think one of the things this project has really done is sort of ground the discussion of data in the lives of ordinary people. I think Sabina's been providing real leadership, as James and others have, for a long time on this. But I think the importance of looking beyond monetary indicators in human development can't be emphasised enough. And we do have, I think, still something of a tyranny of the monetary metric in the way that we think about deprivation. And it's not helpful for all sorts of reasons. That if you talk to people about things that worry them in their lives, poor people, often the circles overlap, and usually money does figure very prominently, but other things figure as well, like dignity, the issues you raise on sanitation, security, and all of these things. So I think challenging that monetary metric is very important. And it's important also because that metric turns out to be much less precise than a lot of people imagine. Half the countries in Africa, we frankly don't have the faintest idea what's going on with trends on monetary poverty, and we pretend that we do by indulging in all sorts of extrapolative exercises. But, they tell us something, but they don't tell us with any precision some of the things that we need to know. I think that's true in other areas as well, which I'll come back to on some of the data points. I think also, this challenges this, what I've always felt is a bizarre cut-off between low-income countries and the rest. The World Bank draws an arbitrary line in the sand somewhere, what is it, $1,000 or, and a country goes from 980 to 1,002, and then everybody holds their hands up, as an extraordinary fact that all of a sudden poverty turns out to be predominantly middle income. And I think if we go back to the starting point, that this data should be telling us about real people's lives, not where people in Washington DC decide to put lines in the sand. It's not that's not helpful. I think also this work turns the spotlight on, and Amina Mohammed made this point, on people who are marginalized and disadvantaged. And if we're serious about some of the post-2015 commitments that are being made, we need better data analytics in this area. And so I think this fills a really important gap. I can't be appreciative enough of the work you guys are doing, which I think is fantastic. For me, and maybe this is an area, just to throw out some ideas for discussion, I think it's really useful to think through how you can adapt and apply this framing to this post-2015 discussion, and in particular the nobody left behind agenda, because at the moment the default comfort zone of everyone involved in these negotiations is essentially to sign up for anything that sounds vaguely ambitious without having anything specific against which you might be held accountable. Now, if you're serious about nobody being left behind, you need to know, first of all, who are we talking about? Like, who's being left behind? Where do they live? What progress are they making relative to the rest of society, to the median and to the top 20%, and so on, in some of these key dimensions? So, I think, I would say there's a market opportunity for you guys there to sort of really think through how you can guide that debate in a more serious way than is currently happening. I think also, that these tools are valuable in application. They tell us something important about the world, but they become even more important when they get a public policy traction. And I know this framing has been taken up by Mexico, which is fantastic. But I would love to see a map of your MPI poverty and destitution indicators against a map of how governments allocate resources. So if we're able to tell where do the people without sanitation live, and then we ask the question, where do governments allocate their resources for sanitation? My instinct is that you would find an almost perfect inverse relationship between. I might be wrong, but I think using it in this way, would be incredibly instructive. One of the findings that really stood out for me was on rural areas. I mean, it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. That I think you have the figure of 85% of MPI poverty in Africa is rural, and something similar in South Asia, actually. I mean, that's a hugely significant finding, because I think the challenges of delivering some of the services that you're talking about, whether it's education or sanitation or water, are actually very different in rural areas than they are in urban areas. They have different cost implications, there are different governance issues. But I do think, I mean, I guess one question for you guys is whether it may be that there are factors which are understating urban deprivation in this, which I'll come back to. But yeah, that is an important finding. I think also, one of the areas that I'm increasingly interested in, that the post-2015 discussion is asking some of the right questions, and I think this is giving us some of the right tools to address those questions. What it's not doing, I think, is asking about the politics. That that if that you've done a lot of cross-country stuff. I mean, what I would be really interested in understanding is why is it that Rwanda, Nepal, Ethiopia have been able to make the progress that they've made? And I don't mean that in the sense like what are the policy levers they've pulled, like what are the political coalitions that have made it possible? And I think that issue has become doubly important because the social makeup and the social profile of the societies that we're talking about is changing very dramatically, because of high growth in Africa. So that the types of coalitions that you can pull together, and the conditions for creating those coalitions for change, is really important to understand that. Maybe just to throw out a couple of data issues. I hesitate to do this sitting next to James, and I suspect I know what the answers are to most of these, but I feel duty bound to ask them anyway. That that you attach equal weighting across very diverse set of indicators, and at some level there is a sort of exchange rate function here across the different dimensions, and implicitly we're attaching equivalence to staying alive and years in school. And I guess a lot of people just question that I know for a fact you've had these debates, but I still think it's worth sort of setting out and explaining why you choose the sort of equal weighting, the equal weighting approach. There are some of the indicators that you use. If you're using for tracking, I think you have some of the same problems that you have on the income poverty side. That that if you actually look at an Excel spreadsheet across many of the countries that you're tracking here, there's a hell of a lot of gaps in them. So if you take the child mortality data, that often these are moving average numbers, many of which are extrapolated actually as well for a lot of parts of the world. But this doesn't really lend itself to fine-tune tracking, as it were. That you've often got different reference years for these different indicators. Some of the education data is absolutely all over the shop on this. If you compare school attendance data with school enrollment data, you typically find a 20-30% disparity. So, I think it would be useful, I think, just to sort of maybe say a little bit more on the weighting functions. And just finally, I think what this lends itself to as well, this the type of data set you've built up, is understanding the interactions between these different dimensions. So, for example, if you take water and sanitation, Robert and I were talking earlier that that if you look at a lot of the stunting figures for India, the malnutrition figures, they're clearly related to sanitation problems. But I think the interaction between water and sanitation deprivation is actually very different in informal, high-density urban environments than it is in rural environments. So, you know, I think bringing that out, or sort of at least exploring those dimensions, is really critical. I mean, if you think back to 19th century European history, like the big human development breakthrough happened, you know, when public health guys worked out how to separate shit from water, to put it crudely. So, you know, this is, I think, you know, a sort of emerging challenge with urbanisation in a lot of parts of the developing world as well. So, Paddy, I'll leave it there.
Well, that's plenty you've left us with. And particularly as you're going to be slipping away, I'm hoping, James, you can deal with some of these points, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm sure the rest of the team here is raring to go, but you help us with some responses to Kevin.